The cold of the stone floor seeped into Elara's bones, a familiar discomfort that was the very essence of her existence. It was a chill that predated the slaver's cell, a coldness that had lived in her heart for as long as she could remember. She was a creature of two worlds, yet belonged to neither. In the human village where she had been raised after her mother's death, they called her the wolf-eyed girl, crossing the street to avoid the taint they sensed on her. In the distant, mist-shrouded territory of her father's pack, she was known as the human-tainted whelp, a living reminder of a shameful indiscretion. Her father, Borin, a lycan of low rank and even lower character, had never let her forget it. He had tolerated her presence for years, a sullen and resentful guardian, until his resentment finally found a price tag. The memory of that morning was a fresh wound. Borin had not looked at her with anger, but with a calculating coldness that was far worse. "The debt is called," he had grunted, his breath smelling of cheap ale. "They will take you to the market. You will fetch a good price." There had been no apology, no flicker of paternal regret. She was simply an asset, a piece of property to be liquidated. The slavers, rough men with eyes like chips of flint, had bound her wrists with cold iron, a metal that sang a dull, painful song against her diluted blood. They did not speak to her, only about her, discussing her potential value like farmers at a livestock auction. Now, standing in the cavernous, opulent hall of the Lycan auction block, that value was being determined. The air was thick with the cloying scent of expensive perfumes and the raw, predatory smell of wealthy lycanthropes. Crystals glimmered overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the proceedings below. Elara stood on a raised dais, wearing a simple, rough spun shift that did little to protect her modesty or her dignity. The auctioneer's voice was a slick, oily instrument, weaving a narrative of potential from her profound misery. He did not use her name. She was Lot 47, a female hybrid, a unique curio. His words painted her as a potential servant, a novelty, a pet for a bored noble. He did not mention the broken spirit, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, or the way her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She made the mistake of looking out into the crowd. Dozens of pairs of eyes, glowing with faint amber or silver light, stared back. Some held clinical interest, others a lurid curiosity that made her skin crawl. One particularly large lycan in silks leered at her, his gaze stripping her bare more effectively than any lack of clothing could. She quickly averted her eyes, fixing them on the grain of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. This was the ultimate humiliation, a ritual of erasure. Every part of her that was Elara was being systematically dismantled, leaving only a body to be sold. The bidding began, a rapid-fire volley of numbers that made her head spin. Each shout was a confirmation of her objectification. 5,000, 10, 20. The voices were disembodied, coming from the shadows of private boxes and the plush seats of the auditorium. She felt herself retreating inward, building a fortress of numbness inside her mind. This was how she had survived her father's disdain and the village's scorn. She would become a stone, feeling nothing, expecting nothing. The warmth of a single tear tracing a path down her cheek felt like a betrayal of that resolve. The final bid came from a stern-faced man standing rigidly near the back. He had not spoken until now. 50,000, he stated, his voice cutting through the din with cold authority. A hush fell over the room. It was an exorbitant sum for a hybrid. The auctioneer's face split into a wide, greedy grin. "Sold. To the representative of the Silvermane Pack, for 50,000. The gavel fell, its sharp crack echoing like the sound of a bone breaking. It was the sound of her old life ending. The Silvermane envoy approached the dais. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, holding no warmth, no pity. He was efficiency personified. He produced a manacle, but it was not cold iron. It was silver, etched with runes of binding. The moment it clicked shut around her wrist, a searing, white-hot pain shot up her arm. It was a pain designed to suppress, to control, to constantly remind her of her place. A whimper escaped her lips before she could stop it. The envoy's grip on her arm was unyielding as he led her from the platform. She did not look back. There was nothing for her there. She was property of the Silvermane Pack, a number attached to a price, a thing to be delivered to her new master. The heavy doors of the auction house swung shut behind her, closing on the girl she had been and opening onto a future of unimaginable darkness. The journey to the Silvermane Keep was a blur of jolting motion and unrelenting silence. Locked in a windowless carriage, Elara had no way to mark the passage of time or the changing landscape. The only constants were the throbbing agony in her wrist from the silver manacle and the grim presence of the envoy seated across from her. He never spoke, his gaze fixed on some middle distance, as if she were merely a piece of cargo he was tasked with delivering. The pain was a clever torment, a searing heat that kept her own latent power, the faint wolf within, pinned and cowering. It was a constant reminder that her body was not her own, that even her blood could be subdued by her owners. When the carriage finally halted, and the door was wrenched open, the sight that greeted her stole the breath from her lungs. The Silvermane Keep was not merely a building. It was a mountain carved into a fortress, a brutalist masterpiece of black granite and soaring towers that pierced the low-hanging clouds. It spoke of immense ancient power, of a lineage that stretched back into the mists of time, and of a cold, unforgiving strength that made her feel smaller and more insignificant than ever before. The air itself was different here, thinner and sharper, carrying the crisp scent of pine and the faint, wild musk of a great many lycans. She was not led through the main gates, but through a smaller, heavily fortified entrance at the side, a servant's passage. The envoy's grip on her arm was impersonal and firm as he guided her through a labyrinth of cold, torch-lit corridors. The stones beneath her bare feet were icy. They passed no one. The silence within the keep was even deeper than it had been in the carriage, a palpable weight of watchful stillness. Her new quarters were a stark contradiction to the keep's grandeur. It was a small circular room, with a single, narrow slit of a window set high in the wall, offering a sliver of gray sky. A simple cot with a thin blanket was pushed against one wall, and a wooden bucket sat in the corner. There was no fireplace, no rug, no sign that this space was meant for anything but temporary containment. The heavy oak door shut behind her with a definitive thud, and the sound of a key turning in the lock was the most desolate sound she had ever heard. The following days bled into one another, a monochrome tapestry of isolation. 3 times a day, a slot at the bottom of the door would scrape open, and a wooden tray bearing a hunk of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a cup of water would be pushed through. She never saw the hand that delivered it. The silver manacle was never removed. Its constant burn became a part of her, a companion to her solitude. She slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of gleaming eyes and the echoing crack of the auctioneer's gavel. During the waking hours, she would sit on the cot, her back against the cold stone, and listen. It was through listening that she learned the rhythms of the keep, the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the faint, muffled sounds of voices from far away. And at night, just as the last light faded from her window slit, she would hear it. A lone, deep-throated howl would rise from the depths of the fortress, a long, mournful note that hung in the air. It was answered by another, and then another, until a chorus of powerful voices swelled into a symphony of primal unity. The sound should have terrified her. Instead, it called to a deep, hidden part of her soul, a part that the silver sought to smother. It was a song of belonging, of family and territory, a world from which she was forever barred, forced to listen from her stone cage. She was an object in a gilded prison, surrounded by the evidence of a powerful, vibrant culture that saw her as less than nothing. The silence between the howls was the loudest sound of all, filled with the crushing weight of her own irrelevance. The change began not with a sound, but with a shift in the very atmosphere of her cell. The still, cold air began to stir, charged with a palpable energy that raised the fine hairs on Elara's arms. It was a feeling of immense pressure, like the moments before a summer storm breaks, but this was alive, predatory. It was the scent of ozone and pine, of raw, untamed power, that made the stone walls themselves seem to shrink back. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, not the clipped, efficient tread of the envoy, but a slow, deliberate cadence that spoke of absolute authority. Every instinct she possessed, both human and Lycan, screamed in simultaneous submission and terror. This was no servant. This was the master of this gilded cage. She scrambled from the cot, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pressed herself into the farthest, darkest corner of the room, pulling her knees to her chest, making her body as small and insignificant as possible. The lessons of a lifetime screamed in her mind. Do not look. Do not challenge. Do not provoke. The key turned in the lock with a smooth, well-oiled click that was far more menacing than any rusty screech. The heavy door swung inward, and he filled the entire doorway. Prince Kaelen was both exactly and nothing like she had imagined. He was taller, his shoulders broader, his presence a physical weight in the small room. He was dressed in dark, supple leathers, and a heavy fur cloak was draped over his shoulders. His face was all sharp, unforgiving angles, a map of lineage and command. But it was his aura that was most overwhelming, a rolling wave of primal dominance that made it difficult to breathe. He did not speak at first. His gaze swept the room, a quick, dismissive glance that catalogued the barren space before settling on her huddled form. She kept her eyes locked on the floor, tracing the cracks between the stones, focusing on the scuffed leather of his boots. "Look at me." The command was not loud, but it vibrated through her bones. It was a voice accustomed to instant, unthinking obedience, a low rumble that promised consequence for defiance. Every fiber of her being recoiled. To meet the gaze of a dominant Lycan was an act of profound significance, a potential challenge. For a creature like her, it could be a death sentence. She pressed herself harder against the stone, her body trembling uncontrollably. A tear of pure, undiluted fear escaped, tracing a hot path down her cheek. I said, "Look at me." The second command was sharper, edged with a flicker of impatience that was more terrifying than his initial calm. It was the sound of a prince whose patience was a thin veneer over a vast volcanic power. There was no choice. Survival demanded compliance. With a shuddering breath, she forced her head to lift. Her gaze, blurred with tears, traveled upward over the powerful lines of his body, over the stern set of his mouth, the strong blade of his nose, avoiding until the very last moment the final, terrifying connection. When her eyes finally met his, the world did not so much fall away as it shattered. His eyes were not the cold, cruel gray of the envoy. They were a burning amber, flecked with shards of molten gold, and in that instant, they were wide, with a shock so profound it mirrored her own. A jolt, violent and beautiful and terrifying, arced between them. It was not an emotion, not a thought. It was a fundamental realignment of the universe, a primal recognition that screamed through her blood and bones and soul. The painful throb of the silver manacle vanished, swallowed by a surge of warmth that blossomed from her very core. The small, cold room seemed to dissolve into a vortex of pure sensation. For a single, eternal heartbeat, she saw past the prince, past the powerful man, and glimpsed the magnificent, ancient wolf within him. A creature of immense strength and solitude that stared back at her not with ownership, but with a staggering soul, deep awe, and from the deepest, most hidden part of her, a part she had been taught to despise and suppress, an answer rose. A warmth, a light, a sense of terrifying rightness flooded her. Meeting his gaze with a truth she had never known she possessed, he stumbled backward a single step, his hand flying to his own chest as if he had taken a physical blow. All traces of the imposing, detached prince were gone, replaced by a man breathless, unmoored, his face a canvas of stunned revelation. "You," he breathed. The word, a ragged whisper, torn from the depths of his being. "It is you." He moved then, not with the slow authority of before, but with a sudden, fierce urgency. He closed the distance between them, and dropped to one knee before her. His gaze was locked on the hated silver band around her wrist. His features contorted, not in anger, but in a kind of pain fury. His own claws, sharp and deadly, extended from his fingertips. With a precise, powerful twist, he shattered the lock. The manacle fell away, clattering against the stone floor, its malevolent hum instantly silenced. The relief from the searing pain was so immediate it was dizzying. His large, warm hands, so capable of destruction, now cradled her freed wrist with astonishing gentleness. His thumb stroked over the raw, inflamed skin left by the silver, his touch a soothing balm. "I have been searching," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion that trembled on the edge of reverence. "I felt this emptiness, this pull, for years. I thought it was a flaw in my nature. I did not know." His amber eyes, now soft with wonder, found hers again. "I did not know it was a missing piece of my soul." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she did not look away. In the depths of his gaze, she saw the shock transforming into a profound, possessive wonder. He saw her, not Lot 47, not a hybrid, not an object. "They told me they had bought a hybrid," he said, his voice low and filled with a terrifying, beautiful certainty. "They did not tell me they had found my mate." The world tilted on its axis, leaving Elara in a state of bewildering suspension. She was no longer in the cold cell. Within the hour, Two silent but wide-eyed servants had escorted her to a suite of rooms so vast and opulent it felt like a dream. Sunlight, real and unfiltered, streamed through tall, arched windows overlooking a misty courtyard. Tapestries woven with scenes of legendary hunts adorned the walls, and a great canopied bed piled with furs and silks dominated the chamber. A fire crackled merrily in a hearth large enough to stand in, its warmth a stark contrast to the pervasive chill of her previous confinement. It was a gilded cage of a different sort, beautiful beyond imagining, yet a cage nonetheless. The door was not locked, but the weight of her new reality was a heavier barrier than any bolt. Her every need was anticipated by the staff, who now treated her with a nervous, reverential deference that was as unsettling as their previous indifference. They averted their eyes when she spoke, their bows deep and formal. They called her my lady, the words tasting foreign on their tongues. She was an enigma to them, a sudden and disruptive anomaly in the strict hierarchy of the keep. This new treatment was a direct result of the prince's gaze, a gaze that had fundamentally altered her status without her consent. She was now the prince's obsession, a title that felt just as possessive as property of the Silvermane Pack, only far more dangerous. Kaelen sought her out that evening. He found her standing by the window, watching the distant figures of warriors training in the yard. His entrance was quieter now, his immense power held on a tighter leash, but she felt him nonetheless, a shift in the air that made her skin prickle. He did not command her attention. He simply stood, waiting until she turned to face him. "Does your wrist pain you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that sought to be gentle. It was the first of many such conversations, each one a delicate, fraught negotiation. He was a man caught between the primal roar of the mate bond and the rigid demands of his crown. He would speak to her of the history of his pack, of the ancient laws that governed their kind, his words carefully avoiding the political tempest her presence had ignited. She learned of the court, a nest of ancient families and powerful elders for whom bloodline was everything. He spoke of his duty, a weight he had carried since birth, a responsibility to secure the pack's future through a strategic, powerful union. He did not need to say the words for her to understand. She was the antithesis of that strategy. A half-breed with no name, no lineage, no political value. Their bond, a sacred and undeniable truth to their inner wolves, was a catastrophic complication in the eyes of his court. A faction led by Lord Theron, a cunning advisor with ice in his veins, and his daughter, the Lady Lyra, a pure-blooded beauty of renowned strength and ambition, saw her as an abomination. Whispers of their outrage slithered through the keep's corridors, carried by servants who glanced at Elara with a mixture of pity and fear. Elara's own heart was a battlefield. The connection she felt to Kaelen was a living, breathing thing inside her, a pull as natural and inexorable as the tide. In his presence, the lonely, fractured pieces of her soul seemed to knit themselves together. Yet, a lifetime of betrayal and survival screamed caution. How could she trust this? How could she trust him? This could all be an elaborate game, a lycan's fleeting fascination with a strange new toy. To surrender to the hope he offered was to risk a shattering far worse than any she had known before. She answered his questions with quiet, measured words, her eyes constantly searching his for a sign of deception, her posture a fortress of self-preservation. He watched her in return, his amber gaze intense, cataloging her every hesitation. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the strength that had allowed her to survive, and the deep well of sadness that lay beneath it. He began to ask about her past, not as a prince demanding a report, but as a man yearning to understand the soul fate had given him. He listened, truly listened, as she spoke in fragmented sentences of her human mother's songs, of the village's scorn, of her father's final, cruel betrayal. And in the quiet moments between their words, he began a secret, urgent investigation. He dispatched his most trusted guard, a grim-faced warrior named Rorik, to trace the shadows of her history. He could feel the truth was out there, a key that might unlock the court's acceptance, or at the very least, arm him against the gathering storm. The prince was no longer just a man who had found his mate. He was a strategist fighting for her place in his world, and she was the prize, the problem. And the only solace he had ever known, the silence in the royal study, was thick with the weight of parchment and secrets. Kaelen stood before a great oak desk, the report from his man Rorik held in his hand. The words written there were not merely information. They were a seismic shock, reordering the entire foundation of his understanding. Rorik's investigation, pursued with a hound's tenacity along the scant trail of Elara's mother, had led him not to simple human records, but to the forgotten archives of Lycan historians and the whispered legends of elders. Elara's mother, Isolde, was no simple village woman. She was the last scion of the Umbrae Sanguis, the shadowed blood, a line of human seers so ancient their name had faded into myth. These seers did not possess the shifting form of the Lycan, but held a different, sacred power. They were visionaries and empaths, able to calm the raging beast within a Lycan, to guide packs through spiritual turmoil, and to see the threads of fate. In a time long past, they were considered equal partners to Lycan royalty, their bond a sacred union that strengthened both bloodlines. Their demise was not an accident of history but a deliberate purge, orchestrated by purist factions who feared their influence and saw their human fragility as a weakness. The very prejudice that now haunted Elara had murdered her ancestors. Kaelen lowered the parchment, his mind reeling. The implications were staggering. Elara was not a flaw in the royal bloodline. She was its restoration. She was not a half-breed abomination, but a living bridge to a lost legacy of balance and power. Her very existence was a rebuke to the narrow-minded doctrines of Lord Theron and his allies. The pull he had felt toward her, the emptiness she had filled, was not just the call of a mate, but the call of a destiny written in the stars. A convergence of two lines thought forever severed. He found her in her solar, bathed in the soft light of the afternoon. She was attempting to read from one of the books he had given her, but her gaze was distant, troubled. She looked up as he entered, and he saw the wariness there. A defense he now understood was built from a lifetime of being told she was less. He did not speak at first. He simply went to her, knelt before her chair so their eyes were level, and took her hands in his. "I have learned something of your mother, Elara," he began, his voice low and earnest. "And in learning of her, I have learned of you." He watched her confusion, the flicker of pain at the mention of a mother she had lost too soon. He told her then, carefully weaving the tale Rorik had uncovered. He spoke of the Umbrae Sanguis, not as a dead history, but as her birthright. He described the seers not as weak humans, but as revered guides, their power a gentle, formidable counterpoint to Lycan ferocity. As he spoke, a profound change came over her. The wariness in her eyes did not vanish, but it transformed into a dawning, staggering comprehension. The strange intuitions she had always dismissed. The deep empathy that had made the village's cruelty so painful. The way she could sometimes sense the mood of an animal or a person. It was not a human weakness or a Lycan failure. It was an echo. It was a power. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of validation. For the first time, the two halves of her soul, which had always warred within her, were not a contradiction, but a synthesis. "This changes nothing for me," Kaelen said, his grip on her hands tightening. "You were my mate from the moment I saw you. But this," he gestured to the parchment, "this changes everything for them. You carry the blood of queens, Elara, not of Lycan queens, but of seer queens who stood beside ours as equals." The knowledge was a kind of armor. She sat straighter, the line of her shoulders losing their habitual slump. The shame that had been a constant companion began to crumble, replaced by a fragile, burgeoning sense of identity. She was Elara, daughter of Isolde of the Umbrae Sanguis, and her existence was not a mistake. It was a reckoning. Yet as this new truth settled in the room, Kaelen knew the danger had only magnified. Lord Theron and his ilk would not see a lost princess returned. They would see a greater threat. A hybrid with a claim to ancient power was far more dangerous than a simple orphan. The game had just become more deadly, and the prize was no longer just his happiness, but the very soul of his pack's future. The grand revel was the pinnacle of the Silvermane social season. A glittering confluence of power, tradition, and predatory politics. The great hall was a spectacle of opulence. Banners bearing the silver wolf sigil hanging between towering pillars. The air vibrating with the murmur of 100 conversations and the haunting strains of ancient music. For Kaelen, it was to be Elara's unveiling, a carefully calculated first step toward presenting his mate to the pack. For Elara, it was a descent into a den of wolves, where she was the designated lamb. She stood at his side, a vision in a gown of deep emerald silk that made her eyes seem less human and more like deep forest pools. The fabric was exquisite, the jewels at her throat priceless, yet they felt like a costume. She was playing a part for which she had never rehearsed, on a stage where every spectator was a critic waiting for her to miss a line. Kaelen's presence was a solid, warm fortress beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back, a constant, reassuring pressure. But even he could not stop the weight of the collective gaze. The stares were not curious. They were assessments. Cold, calculating eyes swept over her, judging the slightness of her frame, the human softness in her features, the way she moved without the innate, predatory grace of a pure-blooded female. Whispers coiled through the air like venomous serpents. Half-breed, curio, the prince's folly. She heard the fragments, each one a tiny pinprick against the new armor of her identity. Then Lady Lyra emerged from the throng. She was breathtakingly beautiful, a statuesque pure blood, with hair like spun moonlight, and eyes of a piercing, glacial blue. Her smile was a masterpiece of condescension. "So this is the creature who has captured our prince's attention," she said, her voice a silken purr that carried effortlessly over the music. "How unique you are." Her gaze swept over Elara once more, a clear dismissal. "I trust you are finding our ways fascinating. They can be so complex for an outsider." It was a masterful public humiliation, designed to highlight Elara's otherness, to paint her as a simpleton bewildered by a culture too advanced for her. The circle of nobles around them fell silent, watching the exchange with rapt attention. Kaelen's body tensed, a low growl forming in his chest, but Elara placed a subtle, calming hand on his arm. She met Lyra's gaze, not with challenge, but with a quiet, unnerving stillness. The newfound knowledge of her bloodline was a steady flame inside her. "Complexity is often a matter of perspective, Lady Lyra," Elara replied, her voice clear and carrying a resonance that surprised even her. "I find that the simplest of creatures often understand the most profound truths. A pack, for instance, is only as strong as its unity. Not the purity of its blood, but the strength of its bonds. It is a lesson even the lowliest wolf pup knows instinctively." She tilted her head, a gesture of genuine curiosity that utterly disarmed the malicious intent. "Do your people teach a different lesson?" The silence that followed was absolute. Lyra's perfect smile froze, then cracked at the edges. She had expected a stammering, cowering girl. She had not anticipated a woman who could parry an insult with a philosophical truth that echoed their own most sacred tenets. The watching nobles shifted, their expressions turning from scorn to thoughtful surprise. In that moment, they did not see a fragile hybrid. They saw a woman with a queen's composure. Kaelen looked down at Elara, his amber eyes blazing with a ferocious, proud wonder. The tension shattered as he formally, and loudly, requested a dance with his chosen mate. He led her to the center of the floor, his possession of her space a clear, unassailable declaration. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of guarded politeness and simmering hostility. But the critical battle had been won. Elara had not broken. Later, in his private chambers, the true storm erupted. Lord Theron confronted Kaelen, his face a mask of cold fury. "This farce ends tonight, Kaelen. That creature will never be our queen. You shame your ancestors and endanger our future." Kaelen's response was not the heated retort of a young prince, but the cold, final decree of a king in waiting. "The only shame here is your blindness, Theron. You look at her and see a human weakness. I look at her and see the restoration of a legacy you are too ignorant to remember." He took a step forward, his power flooding the room. "I have declared her my mate before the entire court. The matter is settled. She is my choice. She is my future. And she will be your queen. Anyone who challenges this," he said, his gaze sweeping over Theron and the other descending lords who had gathered, "challenges me, and they will find my patience at an end." The line was drawn, not in sand, but in stone. The subtle schemes had failed, and the shadow court had been pushed into the light. They would now be forced to show their hand, and everyone in the room knew the next move would be one of desperation, not diplomacy. The air in the wake of the revel was thick with a false calm, the kind that settles before a lightning strike. Kaelen doubled the guard on Elara's chambers, his instincts roaring that the public defeat would force his enemies to abandon subtlety. He was correct. Lord Theron and Lady Lyra, their pride wounded and their ambitions threatened, saw only one path forward. If they could not discredit Elara, she would have to vanish. They orchestrated a plot of brutal simplicity, using their influence to create a diversion at the keep's main gate while a small, loyal contingent of their own warriors moved to kidnap her during her evening walk in the private gardens. The attack was swift and silent. Cloaked figures emerged from the deepening twilight, their movements efficient and lethal. Elara's guards fought with ferocious loyalty, but they were outnumbered. The scent of blood and aggression filled the air, a metallic tang that choked her. As a warrior grabbed her, his grip bruisingly tight on her arm, a terror far beyond fear of death seized her. It was the terror of being erased, of having this newfound life and identity stolen before it had truly begun. But this time, the panic did not paralyze her. It ignited something. A strange clarity descended upon her. The stories Kaelen had shared of the Umbrae Sanguis, of seers who could calm the raging beast, flooded her mind. It was not a conscious decision, but a primal invocation. She stopped struggling against her captor and instead focused on the chaotic, violent energy swirling around her. She closed her eyes, reaching for that deep, quiet well of power inside her, the legacy of her mother's blood. A soft humming warmth radiated from her core, spreading outwards in an invisible wave. It was a song without sound, a melody of absolute peace. The effect was immediate and profound. The attacking warriors, their wolves enraged for the fight, suddenly faltered. Their snarls died in their throats. The bloodlust in their eyes flickered and faded, replaced by a bewildered calm. Their grips loosened. They looked at each other and at their own hands, as if waking from a violent dream. Her own guards, though equally confused, seized the advantage, disarming the now placid attackers in a matter of heartbeats. Elara stood unharmed at the center of the subdued chaos, her chest heaving, her own eyes wide with the shock of what she had done. She had not fought with tooth and claw, but with the very essence of her soul. It was in that moment of stunned silence that Kaelen arrived. He did not run. He erupted into the garden, a force of nature incarnate. Having sensed the disturbance in the bond he shared with Elara, his transformation was already upon him. He was a magnificent, terrifying spectacle of primal fury, a giant wolf of midnight black and burning amber eyes. His roar was a promise of vengeance that shook the very stones of the keep. He saw Elara safe and whole, saw the subdued captors, and understood on a level beyond thought that she had protected herself. His vengeance was swift and absolute. He rooted the remaining conspirators, his power, an unstoppable tide against their suddenly broken will. In the aftermath, under the witness of the full moon, there was no court, no politics, only truth. The conspirators were exposed and imprisoned, their power broken forever. The pack, having witnessed the strength and uniqueness of the princes chosen, now looked upon Elara not with suspicion, but with a newfound reverent awe. She was the seer, returned, the queen, who could temper their ferocity with peace. Kaelen found her standing on the same balcony where he had first truly seen her. He was once again a man, though the power of the wolf still clung to him. He did not speak of victory or duty. He simply stood before her and took her hands, his thumbs stroking her palms. "The bond I feel for you is not a chain," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It is a choice. My soul recognized its other half, and I choose to honor that. I choose you, Elara, not as a possession, but as my partner, my equal, my queen." He was not claiming her. He was offering himself, his heart, his life, his throne, for her to claim. Tears, this time of pure, unshadowed joy, streamed down her face. The last of her walls crumbled to dust. She saw the truth in his amber gaze, felt it in the steady pulse of his hands against hers. She was not being sold or given. She was being asked. "And I choose you," she whispered. The words of vow. As their lips met, a silent pact was sealed under the ancient moon. The girl who had been sold like an object was gone. In her place stood a queen, claimed not by a man, but by a love written in the stars, a union of two souls and two legacies, ready to rule a new era together. The end.